The brass keys felt warm in Marlowe's palm as she walked up the steps to her apartment building. After years of moving from one rented space to another, she finally held the symbol of everything she had worked toward. Her own house. Her sanctuary. The week leading up to this moment had been a blur of anticipation and sleepless nights. As an accountant at Henderson Furniture Company, Marlowe had spent years carefully saving every penny, watching her bank account grow with the discipline that had carried her through decades of temporary living situations. Each apartment had felt like borrowed time, a constant reminder that security was just an illusion when you lived in someone else's property. The fear of unexpected eviction notices, rent increases, or simply being asked to leave had haunted her dreams for too long. But today changed everything. Marlowe practically floated through the apartment door, her heart racing with the kind of joy she hadn't felt in years. The cramped rental that had housed her and Kane for the past 3 years suddenly felt even smaller, knowing that freedom waited just across town. She could already picture herself painting the living room walls a soft sage green, hanging curtains that actually matched the furniture, and most importantly, never again having to ask permission to hang a picture or plant a garden. "Kane," she called out, her voice bright with excitement. "I'm home." Her husband emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. At 42, Kane still had the easy smile that had first attracted her, though lately it seemed reserved for everyone except her. Today, however, his face lit up when he saw her expression. "The keys?" he asked, already knowing the answer from her glowing face. Marlowe held them up like a trophy, the metal catching the afternoon light streaming through their small window. "We did it, Kane. We actually did it. I can't believe it's real." Kane's smile widened, and for a moment Marlowe remembered why she had fallen in love with him. "This is incredible, March. My whole family is so excited about the move." Something in his phrasing made Marlowe pause, but before she could process it fully, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica from work, who had been helping her navigate the overwhelming world of furniture shopping. Marlowe had never owned enough space to justify real furniture before, and Jessica's interior design background had been invaluable. "Hey, Jess," Marlowe answered, her excitement still bubbling over. "You won't believe it. I got the keys." The conversation that followed was a whirlwind of details about delivery schedules and colour schemes. Jessica confirmed that the dining set would arrive next Tuesday, the living room furniture on Thursday, and the bedroom set the following weekend. Marlowe found herself giddy at the thought of coordinating deliveries to her own address, of signing for packages that would stay in her house permanently. After hanging up, Marlowe turned back to Kane with renewed enthusiasm. "The furniture is all set. Jessica says the dining room pieces will be perfect for the space, and we can have everything moved in within 2 weeks. Can you imagine? Our own dining room, Kane. No more eating on TV trays in this tiny kitchen." She began pacing the small living room, her hands gesturing as she spoke. "And the bedroom will finally have enough space for a proper dresser. I'm thinking we could put a reading chair by the window. You know how I've always wanted a reading corner. The master bathroom is big enough for actual towels, instead of these thin ones we've been making do with." Marlowe stopped and took a deep breath, closing her eyes. "I can't wait to just sit in our backyard in complete silence. No more listening to the college kids next door blasting music until 3 in the morning. Just peace and quiet in our own space." That's when Kane chuckled, but the sound didn't match her joy. "Well, Kirsten's kids can be pretty loud too sometimes." The words hit Marlowe like cold water. She turned to face her husband, confusion replacing her excitement. "What do you mean by that?" Kane's expression shifted, becoming more cautious. "I mean, my nephews are also excited about moving in with us." The keys suddenly felt heavy in Marlowe's hand. "Moving in with us? What are you talking about?" "Mom, Rebecca, and the boys," Kane said, as if this should have been obvious. "They're moving in with us." Marlowe stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Explain what that means exactly." Kane's jaw set in the way it always did when he expected resistance. They've been living in that cramped apartment for months now. It's really affecting their quality of life, and this is a perfect chance for them to get away from that busy neighborhood and have some space to breathe. The room seemed to tilt around Marlowe. This house, her sanctuary, her first real home, was supposed to be theirs. Not a boarding house for Kane's family. Not another shared space where she would have to navigate other people's schedules and preferences and noise. "Kane, we never discussed this," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "This house was supposed to be—" "This is my decision, and it's final," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't start being difficult about this." Marlowe felt the familiar pattern settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Every time she tried to express an opinion that differed from his, every time she attempted to advocate for what she wanted, Kane had a way of making her feel selfish and unreasonable. His voice carried that particular authority that had trained her over the years to simply accept whatever he decided. "But this is supposed to be our fresh start," she tried once more, knowing even as she spoke that it was useless. "You're being petty, Marlowe. They're family. Family helps family." The words stung because she knew he would twist any resistance into evidence of her character flaws. She had learned long ago that arguing with Kane only resulted in her feeling smaller and more wrong, even when every instinct told her she had a right to an opinion about her own home. So she did what she always did. She nodded quietly, swallowing her disappointment and frustration like bitter medicine. "Good," Kane said, his satisfied tone confirming that the conversation was over. "I'll call them tonight to work out the details." Marlowe walked slowly to their bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of their bed, the keys still clutched in her hand, and stared at the wall. The excitement that had carried her through the day had completely drained away, replaced by a hollow ache in her chest. This was supposed to be different, but as she sat there in the silence of their cramped bedroom, something shifted inside her. It was subtle at first, like a door opening in a part of her mind that had been locked for years. The disappointment was still there, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt suspiciously like resolve. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Marlowe found herself wondering what would happen if she simply said no. What would happen if she stopped nodding and started speaking? As Marlowe sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of 6 years of marriage pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. The keys to her dream house lay forgotten in her lap as memories began flooding back, each one a small revelation of how thoroughly she had erased herself from her own life. She had always been a people-pleaser. Even as a child, Marlowe had been the one who smoothed over family arguments, who said yes when she meant no, who apologized for things that weren't her fault. It was easier than conflict, safer than standing her ground. But somewhere along the way, being agreeable had become being invisible. The pattern had been there from the beginning of her marriage to Kane. She cooked every meal, scrubbed every dish, laundered every piece of clothing. Kane had never once prepared so much as a sandwich for himself, never touched a vacuum cleaner or a mop. When Marlowe came home exhausted from her accounting job, she would find him relaxed on the couch, expecting dinner to appear as if by magic. "You're just better at it," he would say with that dismissive smile whenever she hinted that maybe he could help. "Besides, I work hard too." But his work seemed to end when he walked through the door, while hers continued until she collapsed into bed each night. She handled all their paperwork, scheduled his appointments, remembered his family's birthdays, and managed their entire household while maintaining a full-time career. And on top of everything else, she paid nearly 70% of their bills. The financial imbalance had started small. Kane explained that he needed to help his mother with rent for the apartment she shared with Rebecca and her 2 boys. It was temporary, he said, just until Rebecca got back on her feet. That was 4 years ago. Marlowe remembered the day Rebecca's business venture had begun its inevitable collapse. She had watched her sister-in-law pour her inheritance, money from selling their mother's house, into a boutique clothing store she had researched for all of 2 weeks. The business plan was non-existent, the location was terrible, and the target market was a complete mystery. "Rebecca, maybe you should slow down a bit," Marlowe had suggested gently during a family dinner. "Have you looked into the demographics for that area? Maybe done some market research?" Rebecca's face had turned red with indignation. "I don't need you to school me, Marlowe. I know what I'm doing. Maybe mind your own business instead of acting like you know everything." Marlowe had retreated immediately, mumbling an apology and changing the subject. But she had been right. Within 8 months, the store was closing, Rebecca was bankrupt, and Pam had lost her house. The whole family had to squeeze into a small rental apartment, funded largely by Kane's income, which meant Marlowe's income, since she was covering most of their own expenses. The most infuriating part came later, when Rebecca was explaining the failure to anyone who would listen. "It wasn't my fault," she would say, her voice taking on that victimized tone Marlowe had grown to recognize. "The recession hit right when I was getting started. And honestly, I think all that negativity from certain people threw me off my game. When someone's constantly telling you to be careful, it makes you second-guess yourself." Marlowe had been sitting right there when Rebecca said it, and she had felt every eye in the room turn to her. The implication was clear. Marlowe's cautious advice had somehow sabotaged Rebecca's doomed venture. And instead of defending herself, instead of pointing out the absurdity of blaming someone else for offering reasonable counsel, Marlowe had apologized. Even now, sitting in her bedroom, Marlowe could hardly believe she had taken responsibility for Rebecca's poor business decisions. But that was who she had become, someone who absorbed blame to keep the peace, who apologized for other people's mistakes to avoid confrontation. As she stared at the familiar crack in their bedroom wall, another memory surfaced, one so painful and ridiculous that it actually made her laugh out loud. The sound was hollow in the quiet room, tinged with disbelief at her own past behavior. They had been married for exactly 1 year when it happened. Marlowe had come home from work to find Kane sitting on their couch, tears streaming down his face. Her first instinct had been panic. Someone had died. He had lost his job. Something terrible had happened. "What's wrong?" she had asked, rushing to sit beside him, her hand immediately going to his back in comfort. Through his tears, Kane had confessed that he was thinking about his ex-girlfriend Maria. They had dated for 3 years before he met Marlowe, and apparently, on this particular day, something had triggered a wave of nostalgia and grief for what they had shared. "I just miss her so much sometimes," he had sobbed into Marlowe's shoulder. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't help wondering what would have happened if we had stayed together." Any reasonable person would have been horrified. Any woman with an ounce of self-respect would have asked her husband why he was crying over another woman, why he was confessing his lingering feelings to his current wife, why he thought this was appropriate behavior. But Marlowe had rubbed his back and made soothing sounds. At the time, Marlowe had felt proud of her maturity, her emotional intelligence, her ability to support her husband through a difficult moment. She had genuinely believed that this was what love looked like: selfless, understanding, accommodating. Now Marlowe realized with startling clarity what had actually happened. She hadn't been supportive. She had been a convenience. Kane hadn't married her because he loved her more than Maria. He had married her because she was safe, because she would never challenge him or demand too much of him. She was the woman who would comfort him while he grieved for someone else, who would pay the bills while he supported his family, who would nod quietly when he made unilateral decisions about their life together. She had been so busy being the perfect wife that she had forgotten to be a person. But for the first time in years, Marlowe felt something other than resignation. As she sat there thinking about Maria, about Rebecca's business, about 6 years of cleaning up other people's messes while her own dreams gathered dust, she felt angry. And anger, she was beginning to realize, might be exactly what she needed. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Marlowe woke before her alarm, her mind already sharp with purpose. Today was moving day, or at least that's what Kane believed. "I'll handle everything with the move," Marlowe said over breakfast, her voice steady and helpful as always. "I'll pack up our things and rent the U-Haul truck. We don't have that much stuff anyway, so I can load it myself." Kane looked up from his coffee with genuine appreciation, the same expression he wore whenever Marlowe volunteered to handle yet another task he didn't want to deal with. He stood up and wrapped her in a hug, his arms feeling heavier than usual around her shoulders. "You're amazing, March. I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice warm with the kind of affection he typically reserved for moments when she was being particularly useful. Marlowe smiled into his shoulder, though the expression felt strange on her face. "What time will you bring your family to the house?" "I promised to take the boys for ice cream first, so probably around 3, Kane said, already mentally planning his day. "Mom's so excited she could barely sleep last night. And Rebecca keeps talking about how the boys will finally have a yard to play in." "You're such a good uncle," Marlowe said, and meant it. Whatever else was wrong with their marriage, Kane did genuinely care about his nephews. "They're lucky to have you." Kane beamed at the compliment, completely oblivious to the storm brewing behind his wife's calm demeanor. If he had been paying attention, he might have noticed the way Marlowe's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, or how her hands remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what she was planning. But Kane had never been particularly observant when it came to his wife's emotional state. The plan was audacious, possibly cruel, and completely unlike anything she had ever contemplated. The house purchase hadn't been completely finalized yet. Ben Feist, the seller, had been generous enough to hand over the keys early, trusting that the remaining paperwork would be completed without issue. All the major documents had been signed, the substantial down payment had been transferred, and the mortgage was approved. But there were still a few administrative details to wrap up, details that Marlowe had realized could be very useful. That evening, after Kane had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from the excitement of the day, Marlowe made her move. She told him she was meeting an old college friend who was passing through town. "Sounds nice," Kane mumbled from the bedroom, already half asleep. "Don't stay out too late." Ben Feist was getting ready for bed when his phone rang at nearly 10 o'clock. He answered with some concern, wondering who would be calling at such an hour. "Ben, this is Marlowe. I'm so sorry to call so late, but I need to meet with you tonight. It's urgent." "Is everything all right?" Ben asked, immediately worried that something had gone wrong with the sale. "Everything's fine," Marlowe assured him. "Could we meet at the diner on Main Street? I know it's late, but this really can't wait." They met, and when Ben heard what Marlowe was proposing, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, certain he had misunderstood. In 30 years of real estate transactions, he had never encountered such a bizarre request. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" he asked, leaning forward across the diner table. Marlowe's voice was steady as she outlined her plan. Ben listened with growing amazement, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "Look, Marlowe, I think I deserve to know why you're asking me to do this," he said finally. "This is, well, it's unprecedented." So Marlowe told him. She explained about 6 years of being taken for granted, about paying for a family that barely acknowledged her contributions, about having her dreams dismissed and her opinions silenced. Ben studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light of the diner. The next day unfolded exactly as Marlowe had orchestrated. While she was supposedly packing and preparing for the move, she was actually implementing the most decisive action of her adult life. She had rented a U-Haul truck, but not for the reason Kane believed. At precisely 3 o'clock, Kane's truck pulled into the driveway of the house on Maple Street. The excitement in the vehicle was palpable. Pam was already planning which bedroom would be hers. Rebecca was discussing the boys' new school district, and the children were bouncing with anticipation about having their own yard. But as Kane parked, his expression shifted from excitement to confusion. A man was sitting on the front porch, a stranger who looked perfectly at home in what was supposed to be their new residence. More troubling, Marlowe's car was nowhere to be seen, and there was no sign of the U-Haul truck she had promised to bring. Kane got out of his truck with a frown, his family following behind him with growing uncertainty. "Can I help you?" the man asked, standing up from his chair with the casual authority of someone who belonged there. "Who the hell are you?" Kane demanded, his voice immediately aggressive. "This is our house. We just bought it." The man introduced himself as Roger, claiming to be the owner of the property. The conversation grew heated quickly, with Kane insisting he was mistaken and threatening to call the police. "What's your name?" Roger asked, his own voice remaining calm despite Kane's increasingly belligerent tone. "Kane Morrison," Kane snapped. "My wife Marlowe bought this house. We have the keys and everything." Roger's face broke into a knowing smile. "Ah, you must be the tenants I was expecting." "Tenants?" Kane was flabbergasted. "What are you talking about? This is our house." The argument escalated until Roger reached down and picked up a rifle that had been lying flat on the porch floor, previously hidden from view. The metallic sound of the weapon being cocked cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "I suggest you get off my property before I have to defend it," Roger said, his voice deadly serious. Rebecca and the boys had gotten out of the truck by now, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Kane, what's going on?" Rebecca called out, her voice tight with worry. "I don't know," Kane replied, his bravado evaporating in the face of an armed property owner. "I don't understand what's happening." With his family's safety to consider, Kane had no choice but to retreat. They piled back into the truck, the children asking confused questions while Pam and Rebecca demanded explanations Kane couldn't provide. He drove straight to their apartment, his mind reeling with possibilities. Maybe there had been some kind of mistake with the paperwork. Maybe Marlowe had gotten confused about the address. Maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. But when he unlocked the apartment door, his confusion turned to ice-cold realization. The space was empty, except for his belongings, his clothes, his books, his personal items. Everything that belonged to Marlowe was gone. His phone calls to Marlowe went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, his panic and fury building with each unanswered ring. Finally, on his 7th attempt, she picked up. "What the hell is going on, Marlowe?" he exploded before she could say hello. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. There's some lunatic with a gun at our house claiming he owns it, and all your stuff is gone from the apartment. What did you do?" Marlowe listened to his rant in silence, her phone pressed to her ear. When Kane finally exhausted his fury, she spoke in a voice he had never heard from her before. "I'm not coming back, Kane." The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. "What do you mean you're not coming back? Stop being ridiculous and tell me what's going on." "I mean, I'm done," Marlowe said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "I'm done being your maid and your bank account and your emotional support system while you make all the decisions about our life. I'm done pretending that any of this is a marriage." "You can't be serious," Kane said, though something in her tone was making him realize that she was deadly serious. "Where are you? We need to talk about this." "We are talking about it," Marlowe replied. "And what I'm telling you is that I've spent 6 years being afraid of losing you, afraid of being alone, afraid of standing up for myself. But you know what I realized? Being alone can't possibly be worse than being invisible in my own life." For the first time in their entire relationship, Marlowe was saying exactly what she thought, and the words kept coming like water through a broken dam. "I was so scared of ending up lonely that I accepted being lonely while married to you. I was so afraid of losing you that I lost myself instead. And I'm done with that. I'm done with all of it." The transformation in Kane's voice was almost comical in its desperation. What had started as furious demands quickly shifted to incredulous bargaining as the reality of Marlowe's resolve began to sink in. Okay, he said, his tone switching from anger to forced reasonableness. "Look, Maybe we got off on the wrong foot about this whole thing. We can work this out. I'll tell Mom and Rebecca they need to find somewhere else to stay. Would that help? Marlowe listened to the familiar pattern, recognizing the calculated progression she had witnessed countless times before. And I'll listen to your opinions more, Kane continued, his voice taking on that persuasive quality he used when he needed something from her. I know I can be stubborn sometimes. We can work on our communication. Couples therapy, maybe. Whatever you want. The promises hung in the air between them, and Marlowe felt something break open in her chest. But it wasn't relief or hope. It was grief. She found herself crying, not for what she was losing, but for what she had never really had. The tears came quietly streaming down her face as she realized that this was the first time in 6 years that Kane was actually listening to her, actually acknowledging her perspective. And it was only because she had finally stopped asking for his permission to matter. I'm sorry, Ma, Kane said, misinterpreting her silence as wavering. I was wrong about the family thing. I should have discussed it with you first. You're right to be upset. We're a team and I forgot that. But we can fix this. The word team almost made her laugh through her tears. They had never been a team. Marlowe, please, he continued, and now she could hear real panic creeping into his voice. Don't throw away 6 years over one mistake. I love you. We can make this work. It's over, Kane, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. I've already filed for divorce. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a switch being flipped, Kane's voice changed completely. The pleading tone vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. You think you're so smart, don't you? He said, his words sharp with venom. You think you can just walk away and start over? Who do you think is going to want you, Marlowe? You're 38 years old. You think there's some line of men waiting for a woman your age with no social skills and trust issues? The cruelty was breathtaking but not surprising. This was who Kane really was when he couldn't control the situation, someone who would weaponize her deepest insecurities to force her back into compliance. You'll come crawling back, he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he fell into the familiar rhythm of emotional manipulation. You'll realize what you gave up, and you'll come back. But I might not be here when you do. I might not want damaged goods. Marlowe listened to the threats with something approaching fascination. For years, these exact words would have sent her into a spiral of self-doubt and fear. The prospect of being alone, of being unwanted, of aging without a partner, these had been the invisible chains that had kept her tethered to a relationship that drained her soul. But Marlowe realized that loneliness was not the terrifying monster she had imagined. Freedom, it turned out, was an excellent companion. Goodbye, Kane, she said simply, and hung up. Her phone began ringing immediately. She watched Kane's name flash on the screen again and again, but she didn't answer. Text messages began flooding in. First, more apologies and promises, then increasingly desperate pleas, then anger and accusations. She deleted them without reading most of them. The next morning, Marlowe drove across town to meet Ben Feist at a coffee shop. She found him already seated at a corner table, looking slightly worried. How did it go? He asked as she sat down. Exactly as planned, Marlowe said, and Ben was struck by how different she looked. The nervous, apologetic woman who had approached him with such an unusual request had been replaced by someone who seemed to take up more space, who met his eyes directly. I can't thank you enough, she continued, and please tell Roger how much I appreciate him playing along. I know it was a lot to ask. Ben smiled and took a moment before he continued. Marlowe, now that you're not with Kane anymore, if you still want to proceed with buying the house, the offer stands. Marlowe felt a flicker of uncertainty cross her face as she considered the possibility. Sensing her hesitation, Ben leaned forward slightly. You know what? You don't have to decide right now. And honestly, if you choose not to go through with it, I'll completely understand your decision. Sometimes what we think we want isn't what we actually need. Thank you for understanding, Marlowe said, relief evident in her voice. "I think I need something that's just mine from the beginning, without any complicated history. That house. It feels tied to who I used to be, not who I'm becoming." Ben nodded, studying her face with approval. "You know, I've seen a lot of people buy houses for the wrong reasons." "I completely understand you after everything that's happened," Ben said with genuine warmth. "I wish you all the best of luck, Marlowe. You deserve every bit of happiness that's coming your way." As Marlowe walked back to her car, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for her own future. For the first time in a very long time, she was the author of her own story, and she was curious to see what she would write next. The small apartment Marlowe rented was nothing like the dream house on Maple Street. It had thin walls, a tiny kitchen, and a view of the parking lot instead of a garden. But it was hers, decorated with her own choices and filled with the kind of peace she had forgotten was possible. For the first few weeks, she moved through it like someone learning to walk again, amazed by the simple luxury of making decisions without consultation or compromise. She had hired a lawyer to handle the divorce proceedings, determined to avoid any unnecessary contact with Kane. The legal dissolution of their marriage could happen without her presence, without her having to see his face or hear his voice, trying to manipulate her one last time. But as the months passed, Marlowe began to feel the weight of staying in the same city where her old life had unfolded. 6 months after leaving Kane, she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid of running into him at the grocery store or the bank. Worse than the fear of confrontation was the way every familiar street corner and coffee shop seemed to whisper reminders of who she used to be. The woman who apologized for breathing too loudly, who paid other people's bills while neglecting her own dreams. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when she spotted Kane's truck in the parking lot of her favorite bookstore. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, waiting for him to leave, feeling her hard-won freedom shrink back into the familiar cage of anxiety and avoidance. That night, she made a decision that would have terrified the old Marlowe, but felt perfectly natural to the new one. She was leaving. Not just the apartment, not just the neighborhood, but the entire city. Maybe the entire state. She had savings, more than she'd ever had when she was supporting Kane's extended family. And for the first time in her adult life, no obligations to anyone but herself. 3 days later, Marlowe loaded her Honda Civic and just drove. As she drove out of the city limits, Marlowe began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had perfected during her marriage, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she had kept locked away for years. She cried for the time she had lost, for the woman she might have been if she had found her courage sooner, for all the dreams she had deferred while trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. She drove and cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, following highways that led away from everything familiar. There was no destination in mind, no carefully researched plan or backup strategy. For once in her methodical, responsible life, Marlowe was simply moving toward whatever came next. By late afternoon, she found herself at a truck-stop diner in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that existed purely for the convenience of people passing through. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few 18-wheelers and a rusted pickup truck. Marlowe sat in her car for a moment, looking at the faded neon sign and wondering when she had last eaten. Inside the diner, everything was beige and chrome, worn smooth by decades of travelers seeking quick meals and strong coffee. Marlowe ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, comfort food that reminded her of childhood before life became complicated. She ate slowly, mechanically, still feeling like she was moving through a dream. The older waitress with kind eyes and sensible shoes kept refilling her coffee cup without being asked, and Marlowe found herself grateful for the small kindness. When she finally paid her bill and walked back outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the highway in shades of gold and orange. At the gas station, Marlowe went through the motions of filling her tank, her mind still processing the magnitude of what she had done. She got back in her car, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. For about a mile, everything felt perfect. The open road, the setting sun, the promise of possibility stretching endlessly ahead. Then her car made a sound like a mechanical sneeze and rolled to a stop. Marlowe turned the key again. Nothing. She tried once more, pumping the gas pedal. Still nothing. The engine was completely dead. She pulled to the shoulder and popped the hood, staring at the incomprehensible maze of metal and wires as if they might reveal their secrets through sheer force of will. Cars passed by occasionally, but most were travelling too fast to notice her distress, their occupants focused on their own destinations. Sitting on the guardrail beside her useless car, Marlowe began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle but grew into something close to hysteria. Here she was, finally free, finally brave enough to chase her own dreams, and she was stranded on a highway in the middle of nowhere with a dead car, and no idea what to do next. The sound of an approaching engine made her look up. An old red Chevrolet truck was slowing down, its turn signal blinking as it pulled over behind her car. Marlowe felt a moment of wariness. A woman alone on a deserted highway had reason to be cautious. But something about the unhurried way the truck moved suggested benevolent intentions. To her surprise, the first person to emerge from the truck was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He had sandy hair and the kind of confident stride that suggested he was accustomed to being helpful. "Do you need some help, Mom?" he asked politely, approaching her with the serious expression of someone taking on adult responsibilities. Marlowe smiled despite her predicament. "I guess I do. My car just died on me." The boy nodded gravely and walked over to her Honda, peering under the raised hood with the air of an experienced mechanic. What seemed to be the problem when it stopped? Marlowe explained about the strange noise and the sudden loss of power, watching with amusement as the boy began checking various components with surprising knowledge. He tried turning the key, jiggled some wires, and even tapped on what looked like important engine parts. 5 minutes later, the driver's side door of the red truck opened, and an elderly man stepped out. He was wearing a well-worn cowboy hat and moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that most problems could wait for careful consideration. He tipped his hat to Marlowe in an old-fashioned gesture that made her think of movies from her childhood. "William," he called to the boy, "time to give up, son. You lost the bet." The boy grinned and wiped his hands on his jeans. "I almost had it, Grandpa. Just needed a few more minutes." The old man chuckled and extended his hand to Marlowe. "Michael Douglas, and that's my grandson William. Don't mind him. He thinks he can fix anything with an engine. Made a bet he could get your car running in 5 minutes." "I still think I could have done it," William protested, but he was smiling. Michael approached the car and immediately frowned, studying the engine with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades diagnosing mechanical problems. He mumbled something under his breath about Honda engines and diesel fuel, then turned to Marlowe with a knowing smile. "Mom, do you happen to still have your receipt from the gas station?" Marlowe pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket and handed it over. Michael glanced at it and began to laugh, a warm sound that made William look up with curiosity. "Well, there's your problem," Michael announced. "You put diesel fuel in a gasoline engine. Happens more often than you'd think, especially at truck stops where the pumps aren't always clearly marked." Marlowe felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Oh no, I'm such an idiot." Michael and William exchanged a meaningful look over the open hood of Marlowe's car, the kind of silent communication that spoke of years spent solving problems. Michael scratched his chin thoughtfully, calculating the work ahead. "Well, Mom, this is going to take some doing," he said finally. "We'll need to drain the tank completely, flush the fuel lines, maybe replace the fuel filter. It's not complicated work, but it'll take time." "How much time?" Marlowe asked, though she realized she had nowhere urgent to be. "If we tow it back to our shop tonight, we can have it running by tomorrow afternoon," Michael replied. "Question is, What are you going to do in the meantime? There's a couple hotels in town if you want to stay there while we work on it. He paused, glancing at William, who was watching the conversation with obvious interest. Or, if you don't mind modest accommodations, you're welcome to stay with us. We've got a spare room and it won't cost you anything but having to put up with this one's chatter. William grinned and nodded enthusiastically. And you wouldn't want to miss Grandpa's fish stew. The boy gestured toward their red truck, where Marlowe could now see fishing rods and a cooler strapped in the back. We just came back from the lake, and we caught a whole bunch of bass. Grandpa makes the best fish stew in 3 counties. Marlowe felt taken aback by their generosity. These strangers had not only stopped to help her, but were now offering her food and shelter. It was the kind of kindness she had read about, but rarely experienced, especially not from people who had no reason to trust her. I don't want to impose, she said hesitantly. You've already done so much, and I'm sure you weren't planning on having a house guest. Nonsense, Michael said, waving away her concerns. We don't get much company out here, and William could use someone new to talk the ear off of. Please say yes, William added, bouncing slightly on his toes. I promise I won't ask too many questions. Well, I'll try not to ask too many questions. Looking at their faces, Michael's weathered kindness and William's open enthusiasm, Marlowe felt something she hadn't experienced in years. These people wanted her company not because she was useful, not because she could pay for something or fix something, but simply because they enjoyed helping others. The feeling was so foreign after her marriage that it took her a moment to recognize it as genuine hospitality. Thank you, she said finally. I'd be honored to be your guest. William let out a small cheer, and Michael smiled with satisfaction. Good. Let's get your car hitched up to the truck, and we'll head home. The ride to their house was unlike any conversation Marlowe had experienced in recent memory. William, perched between her and his grandfather in the truck's bench seat, talked continuously, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement to share everything about their fishing trip. We caught 7 bass, but Grandpa made me throw 3 back because they were too small, which I thought was silly because a fish is a fish, right? Do you like fishing? I bet you'd be good at it. Grandpa taught me everything about fishing, and before that he taught my mom, and she was really good too, even better than most boys, Grandpa says. Marlowe found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. William's questions were genuinely curious rather than intrusive, and he barely paused for answers before launching into the next topic. There was something healing about his uncomplicated enthusiasm, so different from the careful conversations she had grown accustomed to with Kane's family. And we saw a blue heron, which Grandpa says is good luck, and there were turtles sunning themselves on a log, but they all jumped in the water when they saw us coming, which was probably smart of them because William, that's me, can be pretty loud sometimes, can't I, Grandpa? Michael chuckled. Sometimes. Son, you could wake the dead with all your chatter. But it's good chatter, William protested. Right, Miss Marlowe? You don't mind my chatter, do you? Not at all, Marlowe said honestly. I like hearing about your adventures. William beamed and continued his narrative, describing every detail of their day with the kind of total absorption that only children seemed capable of. When they arrived at the Douglas property, Marlowe understood immediately why William was so animated about everything. The house sat on a gentle hill surrounded by towering oak and pine trees, with rolling pastures stretching into the distance. It wasn't a grand estate, but it had the kind of settled, peaceful beauty that spoke of generations of care and attention. The farmhouse itself was modest but well maintained, with a wraparound porch and window boxes that had clearly been tended by someone who loved growing things. Various pieces of farm equipment dotted the yard. In a pasture beyond the house, several horses grazed lazily in the late afternoon sun. It's beautiful, Marlowe said, and meant it. Grandpa's family has lived here for like 100 years, William announced proudly. Well, maybe not 100, but a really long time. Come on, I'll show you around. Michael unloaded their fishing gear while William gave Marlowe an enthusiastic tour of the property. The boy knew every corner of the place, from the old barn where his great-grandfather used to keep dairy cows to the apple orchard his grandmother had planted decades ago. "We don't farm as much as we used to," William explained as they walked past a vegetable garden. "Grandpa says it's because farming is different now with big companies and all. But we still grow our own vegetables and keep some chickens. Do you want to see the chickens?" As the afternoon passed, Marlowe found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. William's constant chatter was oddly soothing, and the peaceful rhythm of the farm worked on her frayed nerves like a balm. She helped him collect eggs from the chicken coop, listened to stories about each horse's personality, and admired his collection of interesting rocks that he had gathered from around the property. When Michael called them in for dinner, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The fish stew was everything William had promised, rich and flavorful, with chunks of tender base and vegetables from their garden. They ate at a scarred wooden table that had clearly hosted thousands of family meals, and Marlowe found herself laughing at William's stories and Michael's dry observations about life in their small community. After dinner, William curled up on the living room couch to watch football, his excitement from the day finally catching up with him. Within minutes he was fast asleep, his head pillowed on his arm and a peaceful expression on his face. Marlowe helped clear the dishes, over Michael's protests that she was a guest and shouldn't work. But she insisted, finding comfort in the simple domestic ritual of washing and drying plates together. Afterward, Michael announced that he was going to work on her car for a while before bed. Marlowe followed him outside to where her Honda sat, hitched behind his truck. Michael had already gathered his tools and was preparing to siphon the diesel fuel from her tank. She stood nearby, not quite ready to go inside, enjoying the cool evening air and the sounds of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. As Michael worked, threading a tube into her gas tank, he began to speak in the quiet, thoughtful way of someone choosing his words carefully. "William seems to have taken quite a shine to you," he said, not looking up from his work. "Boy doesn't meet many new people out here, especially not women." "He's a wonderful kid," Marlowe replied. "You've done an amazing job with him." Michael paused in his work, and something in his expression shifted. "Well, I can't take all the credit for that. His mother, Chelsea. She was the one who really shaped him. I've just been trying to keep up with what she started." The change in his tone made Marlowe pay closer attention. There was grief in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Chelsea was my daughter," Michael continued, resuming his work with the fuel line. "She and William were driving out here for a weekend visit about 2 years ago. Roads were slick from an ice storm, and she hit a patch coming around a curve near Miller's Creek." Marlowe's heart clenched as she understood where the story was going. "Car rolled 3 times before it stopped," he said quietly. "William was in his car seat in the back. Got banged up pretty good, but kids are resilient. Chelsea ... He stopped working and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "She didn't make it to the hospital." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain. Marlowe found herself thinking about William's eager attachment to her, his obvious hunger for adult female attention and approval. Suddenly, his chattiness and enthusiasm took on a different quality. Not just childhood exuberance, but the determined optimism of a boy trying to fill the spaces left by loss. "Where's his father?" Marlowe asked gently. Michael's jaw tightened. "That bastard walked out when William was 6 months old. Couldn't handle the responsibility, I guess. Divorced Chelsea and moved to California. Didn't even show up for the funeral." "I'm so sorry," Marlowe said, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such profound loss. "It's all right," Michael replied, though she could hear the years of accumulated sadness in his voice. "William's been with me ever since. We're doing fine together, aren't we? 2 bachelors making it work." He finished draining the contaminated fuel and straightened up, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Well, that's the worst of it. I'll finish up the rest tomorrow morning, and you'll be back on the road by afternoon." Michael showed her to a small but comfortable guest room that had clearly been William's mother's childhood bedroom. There were still remnants of a young woman's life, a few books on the shelf, some framed photos, a quilt that looked handmade. As she settled into bed, listening to the sounds of Michael still working on her car outside, Marlowe reflected on the strange turn her journey had taken. She had left her old life seeking freedom and independence, but here she was, surrounded by the warmth of strangers who had welcomed her without question or expectation. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the guest room curtains, gently pulling Marlowe from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of country life. Roosters crowing, horses whinnying softly in the distance, and the gentle murmur of voices from the kitchen below. She had barely gotten dressed when she heard William's voice echoing through the house. "Grandpa? Is Miss Marlowe still here? Did she leave already?" There was something almost desperate in his tone that made Marlowe's heart clench. She quickly made her way downstairs to find William standing in the kitchen doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "I'm right here, William," she said softly, and watched his entire body relax with relief. "I thought you might have left early," he admitted, suddenly shy. The simple statement carried so much weight that Marlowe had to swallow the lump forming in her throat. "I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye," she assured him, ruffling his messy hair. "Now, what do you say we make some breakfast together?" William's face lit up with genuine joy, and soon they were working side by side in Michael's kitchen. William proved to be a surprisingly capable helper, scrambling eggs while Marlowe handled the bacon and toast. He chatted constantly about his plans for the day, his enthusiasm infectious. "After breakfast, Grandpa and I always check on the horses, and then we're going mushroom picking in the woods. The chanterelles should be perfect right now. Grandpa taught me how to tell when they're ready. Do you want to come with us?" Marlowe felt torn. Part of her wanted nothing more than to spend another day in this peaceful bubble, learning about mushrooms and listening to William's endless stories. But another part of her knew she was imposing on their kindness, taking advantage of their hospitality when she should be moving forward with her own life. "I don't want to intrude on your family time," she said carefully. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day. "Nonsense. Besides, if you stay a bit longer, I can give your car engine a proper wash. It's covered in sludge from years of work. By the time we get back from mushroom hunting, it'll be dry and running like new." The practical argument won, though Marlowe suspected Michael understood her real hesitation and was giving her a graceful way to accept. The mushroom-picking expedition turned out to be a revelation. William led them through the woods with the confidence of someone who had been exploring these paths his entire life, pointing out different types of fungi and explaining which ones were safe to eat. Michael followed behind, occasionally correcting his grandson's more enthusiastic claims, but clearly proud of the boy's knowledge. "Grandpa says nature provides everything you need if you know where to look," William explained, as he carefully cut a cluster of golden chanterelles from the base of an oak tree. "Free food, free medicine, free entertainment. You just have to pay attention." Marlowe found herself amazed by how much this small family extracted from their environment. They gathered not just mushrooms but wild herbs, berries, and even some roots that Michael promised would make excellent tea. It was a way of living she had never experienced, so connected to the natural world, so self-sufficient and sustainable. "City folk think you need to buy everything," Michael observed as they filled their baskets. "But some of the best things in life are free if you know how to find them." As they walked back toward the house, Marlowe felt a deep reluctance to leave this peaceful world behind. William skipped ahead of them, singing some nonsensical song he was making up as he went, and she realized she had never seen a child so genuinely happy and content. When they returned, her Honda was indeed purring like new. Michael had worked some kind of mechanical magic, and the engine ran smoother than it had in years. She insisted on paying him for his work, but he refused to take anything, saying the parts cost him pennies. "It was my pleasure," he said simply. Not often we get such pleasant company. The moment came for goodbyes, and Marlowe could see William struggling to keep his emotions in check. When she knelt down to hug him, his small arms wrapped around her neck with desperate tightness. William pulled back and attempted a brave smile, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Have a safe trip, Miss Marlowe." As Marlowe drove away from the Douglas farm, her mind was chaos. She couldn't stop thinking about William's face when she said goodbye. The way he tried so hard to be brave when what he really wanted was for her to stay. She had never experienced anything like the fierce protectiveness that had welled up in her when she saw his tears. This was entirely new territory for her. During her marriage, she and Kane had never seriously discussed children. He had always found excuses to postpone the conversation, and she had eventually stopped bringing it up. Now, at 38, she was discovering a maternal instinct she didn't even know she possessed. The feeling intensified as she drove through the town's main street. This wasn't just about William, she realized. It was about finding a place where she could be useful, where her presence mattered not because of what she could provide financially, but because of who she was as a person. On impulse, she pulled into a small convenience store to buy some snacks and water for the road ahead. The elderly woman behind the counter had kind eyes and a warm smile that reminded Marlowe of her own grandmother. "Just passing through?" the woman asked as she rang up Marlowe's purchases. "I think so," Marlowe said, then found herself adding, "Actually, I don't suppose anyone in town is looking to hire an accountant." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. She hadn't planned to ask the question, but something about this town felt right in a way she couldn't explain. The woman's eyes lit up with interest. She took off her reading glasses and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, I'll be darned. Today must be your lucky day, honey. Jim Stevenson over at the farm supply store was just in here yesterday complaining about needing someone to help with his books. His old accountant retired last month, and he's been drowning in paperwork ever since." 30 minutes later, Marlowe walked out of Stevenson Farm Supply with a job offer and directions to a small apartment for rent. By evening, she had signed a lease and was moving her few belongings into what would be her new home. A week later, settled into her routine of small-town life, Marlowe drove back out to the Douglas farm. This time she came bearing gifts: art supplies for William, a bottle of good whiskey for Michael, and a homemade apple pie she had attempted with varying degrees of success. William's reaction to seeing her car pull up the driveway was worth every moment of doubt she had experienced about her impulsive decision to stay. He came running out of the house, his face blazing with joy, and launched himself into her arms before she could even get out of the car properly. "You came back! You really came back!" he shouted, spinning around in her embrace. Michael emerged from the barn with a smile that was both surprised and pleased. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. What brings you back our way, Marlowe?" "I've got some news," she said, setting William down but keeping her arm around his shoulders. "How would you feel about having a neighbour? Because it looks like I'm going to be sticking around for a while." That evening, as they shared dinner and Marlowe explained her decision to stay in town, she felt something she had never experienced before. She had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in her adult life, Marlowe felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Marlowe had been working at Stevenson Farm Supply for 3 weeks when she first noticed Finnegan Murphy watching her with quiet interest. He worked in the warehouse, handling inventory and deliveries, and she often caught glimpses of him through the office window as he loaded trucks or organized shipments. What struck her wasn't his looks, though he was handsome in a rugged, understated way, but his gentleness with everyone around him. She observed how he treated the elderly customers who came in for supplies, patiently helping them load heavy bags of feed into their trucks. She watched him show genuine interest when the local farmers stopped by to chat about their crops or complain about the weather. When he first approached her desk with questions about invoicing, Marlowe was struck by his courteous manner. He didn't assume she would know the answers, didn't talk down to her as the new employee, and thanked her genuinely for her help. The next week, when she mentioned working through lunch to catch up on filing, he appeared at her desk with a sandwich from the deli down the street. "Thought you might be hungry," he said simply, setting down the bag with a shy smile. "Can't have our accountant fainting from hunger." The gesture was so thoughtful and unexpected that Marlowe found herself flustered. It had been so long since someone had anticipated her needs without being asked that she almost didn't know how to respond. When Finnegan finally asked her out, his approach was refreshingly direct, yet considerate. "Would you like to have dinner with me Friday night? There's a little place outside town that serves the best steaks in the county if you're interested." Their first date revealed layers to Finnegan that surprised her. Despite his quiet demeanour at work, he was articulate and well-read, with strong opinions about everything from local politics to environmental conservation. He had attended college in the city, but chose to return home to help care for his aging parents. "You know, from the outside, you don't really seem like what you actually are," Marlowe told him over dessert, genuinely intrigued by the complexity she was discovering. Finnegan laughed. "What did you think I was?" "I thought you were probably nice, but maybe a little simple. Small-town guy, works with his hands, probably watches sports and drinks beer on weekends." "Well, I do drink beer on weekends," he admitted with a grin. "But I also read poetry and can cook a mean chicken piccata. People are complicated, even in small towns." As the months passed, Marlowe found herself falling for Finnegan in a way that felt completely different from her relationship with Kane. Where Kane had demanded her attention and energy, Finnegan offered his freely. He showed up at her apartment one evening with groceries and insisted on cooking dinner for her, then cleaned up the kitchen afterward while she relaxed with a glass of wine. "You don't have to do this," she protested, still adjusting to being cared for rather than being the caretaker. "I want to," he said simply. "You've been working hard all week. Let someone take care of you for once." The relationship felt natural in a way Marlowe hadn't known was possible. They spent lazy Saturday mornings reading newspapers together, took long walks through the countryside, and discovered they both loved old movies and terrible puns. Finnegan never tried to change her or mold her into his ideal partner. Instead, he seemed genuinely fascinated by who she already was. One evening, as they sat on her small porch watching the sunset, Finnegan brought up the future with characteristic directness. "I've been thinking about what it would be like to build something together," he said. "Maybe start a family, put down deeper roots. What do you think about that?" The question took Marlowe by surprise, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented everything she had stopped allowing herself to want. The idea of a real partnership, of creating something lasting with someone who truly saw her. It felt almost too good to be true, but she knew she had to be honest about what had brought her to this town, about the little boy who had captured her heart before Finnegan ever appeared in her life. She watched Finnegan's face carefully, waiting for signs of confusion or resentment. Instead, he smiled with what looked like relief. "I was wondering when you were going to tell me about them," he said. "I've seen how your whole face lights up when you talk about your visits to their farm, and I've been hoping I'd get to meet them soon." "You're not bothered by it?" Finnegan reached for her hand. "Marlowe, the fact that you care so deeply about that little boy just confirms what I already knew. I found a woman with the biggest heart in the world. How could I be anything but grateful for that?" The introduction went better than Marlowe had dared to hope. William took to Finnegan immediately, impressed by his knowledge of farm equipment and his willingness to help with chores. Michael appreciated Finnegan's respectful manner and his genuine interest in the farm's history. By the end of their first visit together, it felt like Finnegan had been part of their extended family all along. 6 months later, when Finnegan proposed on the same hill where William had first shown Marlowe the view of the valley, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden of the local church with their closest friends and neighbours in attendance. William, beaming with pride in his role as ring-bearer, carried out his duties with the serious concentration of someone who understood the importance of the moment. But the biggest surprise came during the reception, when Marlowe and Finnegan asked Michael and William to join them at the front of the gathering. "We have an announcement to make," Finnegan said, his arm around Marlowe's waist. "We'd like to ask Michael's permission to adopt William if he's willing to have us as his parents." The silence that followed was broken by William's gasp of pure joy. "Really? You want to adopt me?" "If you'll have us," Marlowe said, kneeling down to his level. "We love you, William, and we'd be honored to be your family." The tears in Michael's eyes matched those of everyone else present as William launched himself into their arms, and 3 hearts that had been searching for home finally found their way to each other. 3 years had passed since, and life had settled into a rhythm Marlowe could never have imagined. The small apartment had been replaced by a modest farmhouse just down the road from Michael's place, with enough land for a vegetable garden and a few chickens that William insisted on naming after his favourite cartoon characters. On this particular Saturday morning, Marlowe found herself in the neighbouring city's farmer's market, watching as Finnegan and now 11-year-old William examined a display of heirloom tomatoes. "Mum, can we get some of these for the garden next year?" William called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a boy who had never doubted his place in the world. The word "Mom" still sent a warm flutter through Marlowe's chest, even after 2 years of legal adoption and countless repetitions. "We'll see what Dad thinks," she replied, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. William had grown tall and lean, with his grandfather's steady demeanour and an infectious laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest days. Finnegan caught her eye from across the tomato stand and winked, his hands full of seed packets and a small potted herb plant that William had convinced him they absolutely needed. Their marriage had only grown stronger with time, built on the foundation of friendship and shared values that had drawn them together in the first place. "Marlowe!" The voice that spoke her name made her blood run cold. She turned slowly and found herself face to face with Kane Morrison. He looked older, softer around the middle, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he was trying too hard to recapture something that was already lost. His eyes held a mixture of surprise and something else, a calculating quality that she remembered all too well. "I thought that was you," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of ownership that had once made her feel so small. "You look different." Marlowe felt her old reflexes kicking in, the urge to apologise for existing, to minimise herself, to make herself smaller and less threatening. Her heart rate increased, and for a moment she was transported back to that cramped apartment where she had spent 6 years walking on eggshells. "Hello, Kane," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. His eyes swept over her pregnant form with unconcealed contempt. "So you found someone else to take care of you? I always knew you couldn't make it on your own." The casual cruelty of the comment was like a slap, designed to wound her in the place where her old insecurities lived. For a split second, Marlowe felt herself shrinking, felt the familiar shame and self-doubt creeping in. But then she heard William's laughter echoing across the market, pure and joyful as he shared some joke with Finnegan. She looked over to see her husband patiently explaining something about companion planting to their son, his gentle hands gesturing as he spoke. Both of them glanced up at that moment, sensing her distress with the intuitive awareness that came from genuine love and attention. Finnegan's expression shifted immediately when he saw Kane, his body language becoming protective without being aggressive. William, picking up on the tension, moved closer to his adoptive father, his young face serious but unafraid. In that moment, Marlowe realised something profound. She wasn't the same woman who had stood in a small apartment 6 years ago, nodding quietly while her husband made unilateral decisions about their life. She was surrounded by people who chose to love her not because she was useful, but because of who she was. She was protected not by her own silence and compliance, but by the fierce loyalty of 2 good men and the tiny life growing inside her. "Actually, Kane," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I learned to take care of myself just fine. These days, I'm part of a family that takes care of each other. Kane's expression darkened as Finnegan and William approached. There was something different about the way her husband moved. Confident, but not aggressive. Protective, but not possessive. When he reached them, Finnegan's hand settled gently on Marlowe's lower back, a gesture of support rather than ownership. "Everything all right here?" Finnegan asked, his tone polite but firm. William stepped closer to Marlowe's other side, his young face set with determination. At 11, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, thoughtful, loyal, and completely unafraid to stand up for the people he loved. "Kane, this is my husband Finnegan and our son William," Marlowe said, surprised by how natural the introductions felt. "This is Kane, my ex-husband." The contrast between the two men was stark. Where Kane had always demanded attention and deference, Finnegan simply stood calmly, his presence steady and reassuring. "Your son?" Kane asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Bit old to be starting a family, aren't you? And what's this, some kind of instant family situation?" Finnegan's calm demeanor shifted in an instant. Before anyone could react, he stepped forward and delivered a swift, controlled punch to Kane's stomach that doubled him over. Then, with surprising gentleness, Finnegan gripped Kane's shoulder and leaned in close. "Let me make something very clear," Finnegan said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "You will never speak to my wife that way again. You had your chance with her, and you blew it. Now walk away before I forget that I'm a gentleman." Kane straightened up slowly, clutching his stomach, his face pale with both pain and the realization that he was no longer dealing with the submissive woman he once knew. Without another word, he turned and hurried away through the crowd, one hand still pressed against his midsection. "We should be getting home," Finnegan said easily, his arm now encircling both Marlowe and William. As they walked away, Marlowe felt lighter with each step. Behind them, she could sense Kane watching, perhaps finally understanding what he had lost through his own selfishness and cruelty. But she didn't turn back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore. "You okay?" Finnegan asked quietly as they reached their truck. "More than okay," Marlowe replied, settling into the passenger seat while William climbed into the back with their market purchases. "I'm perfect." As they drove home through the countryside she had come to love, Marlowe reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. The baby kicked gently against her ribs, as if agreeing with her thoughts. In a few months, their family would grow by one more, and Marlowe knew with absolute certainty that this child would grow up in a house filled with the kind of love she had spent 38 years learning to recognize and value. "What should we make for lunch?" William asked from the back seat, already planning their afternoon. "Whatever you want, sweetheart," Marlowe replied, watching the familiar landscape roll by through the window. "We've got all the time in the world." And for the first time in her life, she truly meant it. 3 years had passed since Marlowe's wedding day, and life had settled into a rhythm she could never have imagined during her marriage to Kane. The small apartment above the hardware store had been replaced by a modest farmhouse just down the road from Michael's place, with enough land for a vegetable garden and a few chickens that William insisted on naming after his favourite cartoon characters. On this particular Saturday morning, Marlowe found herself in the neighbouring city's farmer's market, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly while she watched Finnegan and 11-year-old William examine a display of heirloom tomatoes. At 6 months pregnant, she was experiencing the kind of contentment she had once thought existed only in movies, the quiet satisfaction of a life built on genuine love and mutual respect. "Mom, can we get some of these for the garden next year?" William called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a boy who had never doubted his place in the world. The word "Mom" still sent a warm flutter through Marlowe's chest, even after 2 years of legal adoption and countless repetitions. "We'll see what Finnegan thinks," she replied, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. William had grown tall and lean, with his grandfather's steady demeanour and an infectious laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest days. Finnegan caught her eye from across the tomato stand and winked, his hands full of seed packets and a small potted herb plant that William had convinced him they absolutely needed. Their marriage had only grown stronger with time, built on the foundation of friendship and shared values that had drawn them together in the first place. Marlowe? The voice that spoke her name made her blood run cold. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively tightening on her belly, and found herself face to face with Kane Morrison. He looked older, softer around the middle, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he was trying too hard to recapture something that was already lost. His eyes held a mixture of surprise and something else, a calculating quality that she remembered all too well. "I thought that was you," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of ownership that had once made her feel so small. "You look different." Marlowe felt her old reflexes kicking in, the urge to apologize for existing, to minimize herself, to make herself smaller and less threatening. Her heart rate increased, and for a moment, she was transported back to that cramped apartment where she had spent 6 years walking on eggshells. "Hello, Kane," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. His eyes swept over her pregnant form with unconcealed contempt. "So you found someone else to take care of you. I always knew you couldn't make it on your own." The casual cruelty of the comment was like a slap, designed to wound her in the place where her old insecurities lived. For a split second, Marlowe felt herself shrinking, felt the familiar shame and self-doubt creeping in. But then she heard William's laughter echoing across the market, pure and joyful as he shared some joke with Finnegan. She looked over to see her husband patiently explaining something about companion planting to their son, his gentle hands gesturing as he spoke. Both of them glanced up at that moment, sensing her distress with the intuitive awareness that came from genuine love and attention. Finnegan's expression shifted immediately when he saw Kane, his body language becoming protective without being aggressive. William, picking up on the tension, moved closer to his adoptive father, his young face serious but unafraid. In that moment, Marlowe realized something profound. She wasn't the same woman who had stood in a small apartment 6 years ago, nodding quietly while her husband made unilateral decisions about their life. She was surrounded by people who chose to love her not because she was useful, but because of who she was. She was protected not by her own silence and compliance, but by the fierce loyalty of 2 good men and the tiny life growing inside her. "Actually, Kane," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I learned to take care of myself just fine. These days, I'm part of a family that takes care of each other." Kane's expression darkened as Finnegan and William approached. There was something different about the way her husband moved. Confident, but not aggressive. Protective, but not possessive. When he reached them, Finnegan's hand settled gently on Marlowe's lower back, a gesture of support rather than ownership. "Everything all right here?" Finnegan asked, his tone polite but firm. William stepped closer to Marlowe's other side, his young face set with determination. At 11, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, thoughtful, loyal, and completely unafraid to stand up for the people he loved. "Kane, this is my husband Finnegan, and our son William," Marlowe said, surprised by how natural the introductions felt. "This is Kane, my ex-husband." The contrast between the 2 men was stark. Where Kane had always demanded attention and deference, Finnegan simply stood calmly, his presence steady and reassuring. Where Kane's love had come with conditions and expectations, Finnegan's was freely given and constantly renewed. "Your son?" Kane asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Bit old to be starting a family, aren't you? And what's this? Some kind of instant family situation?" William stepped forward then, his young voice clear and confident. "She's my mom in every way that matters, and she's going to be an amazing mom to my little brother or sister too." The simple statement, delivered with complete conviction, seemed to deflate whatever power Kane thought he still held over the situation. Marlowe felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. "We should be getting home," Finnegan said easily, his arm now encircling both Marlowe and William. "Nice to meet you, Kane. Marlowe's told me you were an important part of her learning what she didn't want in life." As they walked away, Marlowe felt lighter with each step. Behind them, she could sense Kane watching, perhaps finally understanding what he had lost through his own selfishness and cruelty. But she didn't turn back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore. "You okay?" Finnegan asked quietly as they reached their truck. "More than okay," Marlowe replied, settling into the passenger seat while William climbed into the back with their market purchases. "I'm perfect." As they drove home through the countryside she had come to love, Marlowe reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had thought she was buying a dream house all those years ago, but what she had really been searching for was a dream life. And she had found it in the most unexpected place. The baby kicked gently against her ribs, as if agreeing with her thoughts. In a few months their family would grow by one more, and Marlowe knew with absolute certainty that this child would grow up in a house filled with the kind of love she had spent 38 years learning to recognize and value. "What should we make for lunch?" William asked from the back seat, already planning their afternoon. "Whatever you want, sweetheart," Marlowe replied, watching the familiar landscape roll by through the window. "We've got all the time in the world." And for the first time in her life, she truly meant it.